Thank you. Mr. Guerin, you may continue.
Thank you. I started to ask you about Joshua, or Josh Godbey, who's shown on the organizational chart as being several levels below you. Who is Josh Godbey? Yep.
Josh Godbey was the division chief for financial litigation and charitable trusts. Actually was not several levels below me. He reported sort of directly to me and David Hacker, who was my associate deputy attorney general for civil litigation.
Okay, and I asked you about that because I wanted to ask you whether in deciding any intervention in a charitable trust litigation, do you rely on advice that you get from the people in the trenches, the ones that work on it?
I certainly seek and consider that advice, yes.
Well, with the MIDI litigation, was Mr. Godbey opposed to an intervention?
He did not believe an intervention was necessary.
And yet you intervened. Why?
We intervened because the Attorney General Paxton, believed that it was.
I'm not asking what he believed. Did he tell you to intervene?
Yes, General Paxton told me that we should intervene in the litigation because the MIDI Foundation was wasting a lot of money on unnecessary litigation, and that the MIDI Foundation had management problems in the past, although those are pretty far in the past, I think, at that point, and that it didn't make sense for this lawsuit to continue and go forward, and that we needed to try to intervene and see what we could do to bring it to a conclusion.
Well, what was one of the reasons that the MIDI Foundation was wasting money on attorney's fees?
Well, they were locked in a very, very contentious litigation with the world-class limited partnerships that were headed by Nate Paul.
Is it true that in the type of lawsuit that the MIDI Foundation originally brought, if they were successful, the MIDI Foundation would recover their attorney's fees?
I don't know, actually.
Okay. At any rate, we've previously seen that there were, I think, two people that wrote the waiver menu, the waiver memo, a woman named Henderson and a woman named Day. They're not even on this chart. Were they further down in the hierarchy?
Yes.
Okay. So when General Paxton asked that you intervene, did you do so against the advice of Josh Godbey and who you relied on for advice?
Objection, Your Honor. This is calls for hearsay from people that haven't testified.
Sustained.
Okay. I want you to describe for the senators, please, the level of interest that General Paxton took in the MIDI Foundation litigation.
Objection, Your Honor. Speculation.
That, as you observed.
Sustained and re-asked.
Well, I was trying to cure the objection by saying that you observed. Describe for the Senate the level of interest that General Paxton took in this litigation, as expressed to you by General Paxton himself.
Again, Your Honor, if he wants to tell us what General Paxton may have said to him, I won't object to that, but just telling us what was in his mind, he cannot do that.
I think that's what
Objection,
I asked.
speculation.
As expressed to him by General Paxton.
I think that's what you asked. Overruled.
You may answer.
General Paxton expressed sort of more interest in the MIDI Foundation litigation than almost anything else that my divisions were interested in. There was a certain urgency and almost anxiety around what we were doing in the MIDI foundation lawsuit, to the extent that, at times I got calls, I remember a call very early in the morning one time. I got pulled out of an important teleconference that I was in to talk about the Mitty Foundation. That was highly unusual. That really didn't happen with any frequency about anything. And General Paxton wanted to be kept abreast of any developments in the Mitty Foundation lawsuit.
Was there other major litigation going on that you were supervising?
Well, at the time...
And that's a yes or no. Was there other major litigation?
Well, yes, absolutely.
What was the Google investigation and litigation?
So I have been tasked to lead the Google antitrust investigation that was being conducted by a number of states. So it was a multi-state investigation, I believe 48 states at that point. Only Alabama and California had not joined. And we were investigating Google search function, antitrust potential violations, and the Google ad tech antitrust violations. Texas was really the lead on the ad tech issues. So I sort of had a day job that was overseeing the divisions, the civil divisions. And then in addition to that, I was trying to provide a leadership role for all the states on those investigations. And, of course, both of those investigations, probably most of the people here know, resulted in significant lawsuits filed not only by Texas, but follow-on suits by the federal government and even in Europe.
So, in a nutshell, was the Google litigation a major involvement of the Attorney General's office? Yes or no?
Absolutely, yes.
And compare the significance of the Google litigation with the significance of the Mitty Foundation against Nate Paul litigation.
Well, the Google litigation, of course, has had the potential to impact virtually every Texas and U.S. citizen, and frankly, citizens across the world. The Mitty Foundation litigation, as I understood it, was, a dispute that Texas, in my view, did not have any significant interest in. And I believe that the Mitty Foundation was being, especially when I got involved with it, I believe that the foundation was being zealously represented.
Okay. And that's one of the criteria for intervening or not intervening. If everything's going smoothly with the foundation, they're zealously represented, correct?
Yes.
All right. So, I think you mentioned being interrupted as an example of General Paxton's interest in the Mitty litigation as opposed to anything else. Was there an occasion when you were interrupted during an important Google conference? Yes. Or no?
Yes.
Okay, what was that occasion?
I recall that I was on a teleconference with an international economist of some reputation, trying to interview that economist to decide whether he would be a good fit to work on the Google investigation at that time and possible litigation. And General Paxton sort of opened my door, and I put it on mute, and he said, "Hey, can you come down to my office?" And I explained roughly what I was doing, and I said, "Should I break this off and come down?" He said, "Yes." So I did, and I went to his office, and we had a discussion about the Mitty Foundation.
Did that seem unusual to you, that he would pull you away from an important conference on the major litigation over Google to talk about the Mitty Foundation litigation?
I don't recall another time when General Paxton interrupted a conversation or discussion with anyone else I was having to pull me away.
Let's talk about some of the things that you were requested to do Did there come a time when you received, and you were on the email chain, of complaints from Nate Paul about how the Attorney General's office was handling the Mitty Foundation litigation?
Yes, after I had become...
Okay, that's the answer to that.
Yes.
Then I'll ask you about it.
I'm a lawyer. I'm a bad witness. I'll try to be better. I'm sorry.
Lawyers are some of the worst witnesses. Yes, I agree. So what happened with the emails that the office and you were copied, and particularly Josh Godbee was getting from Nate Paul?
Yeah, so we got a few communications. I don't remember how many. From Nate Paul, and I think one was either from Nate Paul or from Michael Wynn copying Nate Paul or something like that, vigorously complaining in really sort of a demeaning fashion about our work in the Mitty Foundation lawsuit, and demanding that we do more in the lawsuit, sort of taking a tone of directing us.
Let me stop you there. Mm-hmm. So you said it was the emails were taking the tone of Nate Paul directing you, the Attorney General's office?
Your Honor, I object. We have the emails and we can look at them, but this is misrepresenting what the emails say, and I object to it.
Well, let's look at the emails. I agree. House Managers 86, it's in by agreement, if you could pull that up. Let's start. Let's start on the second page of that. At the bottom of the second page, an email from Nate Paul to Josh Godbee in the Attorney General's office. I'll just read that first line. Josh, I am following up to my previous emails for the fourth time. Your decision to not even respond to my emails has only amplified my concerns about your bias toward helping the Mitty Foundation. You see that?
I do see that.
First, is it proper for a litigant who's represented by counsel to contact the lawyer for one of the other litigants? Is it or not?
It's certainly not something that's certainly it's something that's generally not done. That is correct.
All right. A little bit above that, a little bit later, July the 2nd, Josh, I need to hear from you. You are delaying this and it is unacceptable. Is that the kind of tone that you're used to receiving from a litigant?
Absolutely not.
The first page of that exhibit, Sunday, July the 5th, from Nate Paul, Josh Godbee. Josh, you have exhibited highly unprofessional behavior. You see that?
I do.
And above that, Josh, I just wanted to make sure your office is aware that you never responded to any of the emails below. First, what's your testimony about whether it would be proper for Joshua Godbee to respond to Nate Paul's emails?
That was something that we would not typically have done.
So, what was your thought about what was going on here and how Nate Paul was treating the office of Attorney General?
Well, I thought his tone was demeaning and demanding and wholly inappropriate, because thinking about this, the way this is structured and the way our involvement with charitable trusts is structured is we are making the decisions about what is in the public interest of the charity, not somebody who's working against the charity in a lawsuit.
Now, while this is going on, what's your contact with General Paxton about what you're doing in the Mitty Foundation lawsuit?
I was having fairly regular conversations with General Paxton about
What was he asking?
He was asking, about ideas for how we could really get to a point where we could terminate the litigation. I think he was looking for a creative way to do that. And I don't mean creative in a sense of outside, legal means, but a creative way for us to, our involvement to accelerate the termination of the lawsuit.
Well, let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah.
To accelerate termination of the lawsuit, in essence, was the lawsuit, the Mitty Foundation suing Nate Paul because they were claiming that he was cheating them.
Yes.
And so...
In so many words, yes.
Well, I was trying to shorten
Yeah.
the description of it a little bit. And so if that's the fact, if they're suing Nate Paul for trying to cheat him, what's the public interest in the Mitty Foundation litigation for the Attorney General to take? Which side are you supposed to take?
Well, we're clearly supposed to take the side of the foundation.
And what was General Paxton's direction to you?
General Paxton was highly critical of the Mitty Foundation's litigation efforts, and he characterized those to me as being overly zealous and wasteful.
Okay. Did you become aware during this time that there had been a settlement of the lawsuit previously by mediation between Nate Paul's interests and the Mitty Foundation?
Yes.
What was that settlement? What was the dollar amount of that settlement, if you remember?
It's testing my memory a little bit, but I believe that Nate Paul's entities had agreed to pay the Mitty Foundation $10.5 million to buy out their interests in the world-class properties.
And did he pay it?
No, the world-class did not pay it and therefore breached the settlement agreement.
And that was a settlement agreement after mediation?
After a mediation, yes. Can I pause there? I actually don't remember whether it was the result of a mediation, but it was certainly the result of some negotiation.
Fair enough. Did General Paxton press you to move for a second mediation? I know you don't know whether it was second or first, but did he press you to move for a mediation?
Yes.
Now, was Mr. Godbee supposed to be handling this?
Mr. Godbee had sort of taken frontline responsibility for this prior to my involvement, yes.
And after these emails where Nate Paul was criticizing Josh Godbee and his handling of it, what did General Paxton tell you to do?
Well, on more than one occasion, he asked me to be directly involved.
Is that unusual?
Incredibly unusual for someone in my role at that time, yes.
Explain why that's incredibly unusual.
Well, as I said before, we had 12 divisions, we had 325 lawyers, and we had 34,000 open matters. So for someone in my position to have direct involvement in any particular litigation what was just highly abnormal. And so in my experience during the 2 years I was in that position, there were only a very few limited examples of when I was directly involved in litigation.
Okay.
Very few.
So ordinarily, would it be handled by somebody down the chain?
Yes, I might be advising if there were a problem or it was significantly important, but not important enough for me to be in directly. But for me to appear and be personally involved was highly unusual.
So did there come a time when General Paxton ordered you to appear in a hearing?
He did call me very early one morning. I want to say it was sometime around 7:30, and asked me to appear at a Mitty Foundation world-class hearing in Travis County District Court that morning.
Now, not to diminish the importance of a Travis County District Court, but educate the senators on whether the appearance of a deputy attorney general in district court in Travis County would be unusual.
I only did that one other time during the course of my role, and that was when Google contested our right to get information under a confidential information demand issued by our antitrust division.
But in this case involving the Mitty Foundation lawsuit trying to get or suing Nate Paul for fraud or cheating him, what's the unusual thing about having a deputy attorney general appear there?
Well, I think in retrospect, it certainly sends a message of interest from the Attorney General's office that's highly unusual. And also, as I recall, that hearing was going to be a very long hearing. I think it was scheduled for a very long period of time. And, obviously there were a number of things going on at the AG's office, and we've concentrated on the Google matter. But, the COVID matters were hot and heavy, I think, still at that point. There were mask mandate issues, and there were also, we were getting calls and concerns from major cities about potentially releasing people from jail that have been accused of violent felonies. I mean, there were times.
Okay, let me stop you there.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is you had a lot of other stuff on your plate.
Yes, particularly at that time.
And you get a call at 7:30 in the morning from General Paxton asking you to appear in Travis County District Court on motions that might last all day?
My recollection is that it was to be a lengthy hearing, yes.
Were you prepared?
I was not prepared at all.
What did you say to him?
I said it didn't make any sense for me to do it because I wasn't prepared and because of the time and all the other things I had scheduled that day.
And what did he say to you?
He said, well, then I'll do it.
He'll do it? General Paxton will himself go to district court in Travis County to argue a motion?
Yes, that's what he told me.
What did you think about that?
Well, I talked him out of it.
What?
I talked him out of it.
Again,
I guess what I thought about it was that it was a terrible thing for him to do.
And why?
Because he was the Attorney General of Texas. He never appeared in court, not once, not a single time. And, as a representative, right, as a lawyer, I should say, let's put it that way. And for him to make an appearance in that type of hearing sends a very odd message. And it didn't seem appropriate for our office to have that sort of level of involvement in a case like this at all.
Okay, I don't want to get too far in the weeds of all the stuff that happened in the Mitty Foundation litigation, but was there an occasion where General Paxton told you to go to a mediation, a virtual mediation, but told you to go to a mediation?
Yes.
And what did General Paxton tell you to do as far as trying to get the Mitty Foundation to accept less than they'd accepted before?
Well, General Paxton asked me to attend the mediation on behalf of the state and work to get a settlement in the case for, to essentially terminate the litigation.
What do you mean by terminate the litigation?
Well, via settlement, terminate the litigation via settlement. And so we worked hard. We actually filed a motion to stay the proceedings in favor of mediation. Which,
Let me ask you that. As I said, I don't want to get in the weeds of what happened. The motion to stay the proceedings, the mediation, pressure during the mediation. In retrospect, and knowing what you know now, was that in the public interest of the Mitty Foundation for the Attorney General, Paxton, to take that position? Yes or no?
Knowing what I know now, no.
Why not?
Because our involvement in the Mitty Foundation litigation added complications for the Mitty Foundation. And we stayed, and briefly, and I was pretty adamant that we needed to do it quickly if we were going to stay the proceedings. But, it stayed the proceedings for a period of time. I think that the Mitty Foundation saw it as fairly heavy-handed. And it just,
Let me ask
knowing
you
now
about
what I know, I don't think that we were helping the Mitty Foundation in any way.
say that again. You were not helping?
We were not helping.
Wasn't that what the Attorney General's office is supposed to do?
We are supposed to protect the interests, the public interest in charitable trusts.
And as it turned out, were you actually trying to protect Nate Paul's interest because that's what Paxton told you to do?
Objection leading.
That is leading. I'll rephrase it. What did General Paxton tell you to do? Whose side to take in the mediation?
Well, he told me to contact Sheena Paul, who was Nate Paul's sister, and work with her to, sort of develop a strategy for the mediation, or a strategy. I mean, I don't know if he said the word strategy, so I don't want to, I want to be careful about what was actually said, but he told me to call her, try to understand their position, and, I think he said, sort of dramatically, I just want all this to end.
General Paxton said he wanted all this to end.
That's correct.
Was that in the best interest of the Mitty Foundation or the public interest in it?
Well,
Yes or
certainly.
no? Yes or no?
Can I explain?
You can, but I'd like to get a yes or no to that. Was that in the best interest of the Mitty Foundation or the public interest in it, or was it in the best interest of Nate Paul?
Well, understanding everything that was going on and the fact that the Mitty Foundation thought that there was far more return on this investment available than I think even the $10.5 million settlement that had been reached before. No, because it was clear that we were not going to settle for $10.5 million. The Mitty Foundation was not going to settle for $10.5 million. I'm sorry. They were not going to get $10.5 million because the world-class entities were not going to offer it. And they thought that they could get more than the 10.5 through litigation. And so no, we were not helping the Mitty Foundation.
Did the mediation fail?
It did.
And so after that, and getting forward now to the end of September, what did you learn about the Attorney General's office involvement in other matters that involved Nate Paul?
Objection. This answer calls for information based on hearsay.
Sustained.
On September the 29th, did you get a call?
Well, on September 29th, I was called to a meeting
Where?
in Jeff Mateer's office.
Without going into what was said, one of the previous witnesses today was a young lawyer named Brandon Kamek. Did you learn anything about him, yes or no, that day? I'm not asking you what you learned.
Yes.
And did you learn or see subpoenas, grand jury subpoenas, that had been issued to players in the Mitty Foundation case?
I saw a criminal grand jury subpoena that had been issued to a bank.
What was your reaction to that?
I was stunned.
What do you mean? Explain it.
I saw a criminal grand jury subpoena directed to a bank that was clearly seeking information that would have aided world-class Nate Paul's efforts against the Mitty Foundation.
Why is that bad?
Well, it's one thing is it's lawyer ethics 101, so that was the first thing that came to my mind. We are weaponizing the criminal process to aid a civil litigant, and that is a big no-no.
So, as far as the Mitty Foundation was concerned, and now you learning about these grand jury subpoenas issued to players in the Mitty Foundation lawsuit, what was your opinion about what had happened to the Mitty Foundation as a result of the Attorney General Paxton's request that, or demand that you become involved?
I believed that the Attorney General's office's involvement in the Mitty Foundation litigation was unethical, against our statutes, and I highly suspected corrupt.
What did you do as a result? By the way, did you attend a meeting, a conference between a number of the deputies of the top deputies of the Attorney General's office?
I did.
And did you trade information?
Yes.
Did you learn things that you had not known about before?
Several.
And did it concern you?
Deeply.
What did you do with regard to the Mitty Foundation litigation as a result of what you learned?
Within 24 hours, I don't remember exactly how quickly, I ordered Mr. Godby, the head of the Charitable Trust Financial Litigation Division, to dismiss our intervention in the lawsuit.
House Managers Exhibit 92 is in evidence by agreement. This is an email from you dated September the 30th, 2020. It's to Josh Godby, Rachel Obaldo. I don't believe we've heard her name before. With copies to Mateer and to Bangert. What did you order done?
Please immediately withdraw from and cease all representation, investigation, or participation concerning the Mitty Foundation that may in any way whatsoever relate to World Class, its related entities, or Nate Paul.
You let your voice trail off.
I'm sorry, it may have been the microphone. I can read it quickly. Please immediately withdraw from and cease all representation, investigation, or participation concerning the Mitty Foundation that may in any way whatsoever relate to World Class, its related entities, or Nate Paul.
And why did you do that?
I did it because I believed at that point that the AG's office intervention into the Mitty Foundation was unfounded. And as I said, I believed unethical, and I believed it was actually attacking a charitable trust as opposed to defending the public interest in a charitable trust. I believed I had an ethical duty under our rules because we had now used the criminal justice system essentially against the Mitty Foundation. And, frankly, my name, my colleagues' names, including Jeff Mateer, Josh Godbee, I think Ryan Bangert, and now my recollections refresh, Rachel Obaldo. Importantly, the Attorney General's name, and maybe most importantly, the state of Texas's name, had been used and invoked improperly, clearly improperly, against the Mitty Foundation that was a public charity.
Were you one of the 7 deputies that went to the FBI?
Yes, I was.
Why, briefly, did you go to the FBI? First, did you want to?
Absolutely not.
And did you decide to be one of the 7 that went to report to the FBI?
Yes.
Why?
Because I believed that the Attorney General's office had been, and its resources, and I'm sure those in this room understand that the Texas Attorney General's office is one of the most powerful in the nation and incredibly important for a number of reasons. And I believe that it had been turned over by Attorney General Paxton to a private citizen to do his bidding, and it was acting against the interests of the state of Texas. And in my own experience with the Mitty Foundation, I believe acting against another citizen, a charitable trust and all of its beneficiaries, in the state of Texas, and that the criminal process that had been initiated that I just learned of was potentially immediately endangering the public, the Mitty Foundation, and potentially others.
Did you and the others ask General Paxton to meet with you after that?
Jeff
Yes or no?
Mateer, I recall, sent General Paxton a text asking him to meet with us.
And did he meet with you?
He did not.
I want to talk very briefly about any retaliation against you for being one of the persons that went to the FBI. Were you retaliated against?
Well, yes, frankly, and I want to make this clear, I don't believe I suffered the level of retaliation that some of my colleagues did. However, I remember the first thing that I was sort of stunning to me was that I saw a press release released by our office, not by General Paxton or his campaign, but by our comms office, a press release that said officials in his office were being criminally investigated for impeding, I guess, impeding an investigation or something of that nature, which was sort of shocking and I suppose supposed to be intimidating.
Was that true or not?
I am not aware of I was never made aware of any sort of criminal investigation of any of my colleagues, no.
Were you called a rogue employee?
Absolutely.
Do you believe you were a rogue employee?
No, I believe that I was doing what I had to do, as unpleasant as it was, and it was quite unpleasant.
I'll pass the witness, Your Honor.
Mr. Busby?